The nothing box. What are you thinking about? Nothing. It's legit. It's really what I'm thinking about. So we're going to be talking about the home today. Let me kind of bring us up to speed, and we're going to review a few things, and then we're going to bring Ashley up in a few moments to help kind of navigate these tough waters. But we are in a series called Exiles, and if you've been with us, then you know that Peter has been talking to a group of Jesus followers who have been scattered throughout what we now know as Asia Minor. And Peter is directing his comments to people who are being persecuted at a lot of different levels. They're suffering. They are suffering in society. They've been ostracized. They are suffering in their homes as they try to navigate these waters of one person who's following Jesus, one who's not. They are being persecuted in their workplaces. There's still obviously kind of the master-servant dynamic in that culture. And so those who are Christian servants are being persecuted and suffering, many of them at the hands of unjust masters. They have been persecuted in their work environment, just at every level. Their friendships, they're facing persecution. And so Peter is addressing this group of Jesus followers to basically talk to them about what does it look like to follow Jesus in a culture that is anti-Jesus, that is hostile toward their faith. And what we've learned, if you've been here, and if you haven't been here, let me encourage you to go back and catch up on our podcast or our videos online. But if you've been here, what you've learned is that Peter is emphasizing that who we are in Jesus precedes everything else. That all of life is kind of controlled by this idea of who we are in Christ and whose we are. That we belong to Jesus. That the way we've said it is our who always precedes our what or our how. That we have to know who we are. And the key phrase for this entire book of 1 Peter is that we are elect exiles. And those two words are very significant throughout this entire letter. The word elect means that we are God's, that we are His, that we have been chosen by Him, redeemed by Him, preserved by Him, that at every level we belong to Jesus. And that word exiles reminds us that we are just passing through, that everything around us in this world is temporary, that we are headed toward an eternal kingdom. But we are also dual citizens. We are living in an earthly kingdom, a temporary kingdom, headed toward an eternal kingdom. So that's part of this kind of weird tension, isn't it? How do we live as heavenly citizens in an earthly kingdom? And that's what Peter's been dealing with. That our identity affects how we function in this broken world. That our identity of being in Jesus, belonging to Jesus, that we are His, impacts how we live that out. And I love that Peter just doesn't leave this in theory. He doesn't just give us the theology and then leave it there. He's in touch with reality. And Peter takes it into the political arena. He takes it into the social arena. He takes it into the workplace. And today he takes it into our homes. Because how we function in this world is impacted directly by who we are. And what we've said week in and week out is because of who we are, that many times how we live that out is very countercultural to the world around us, that it's very different than the world around us. And so Peter brings it very street level. And last week he introduced us. I know last week was kind of a holiday week and a lot of people were out. Let me encourage you to go back and listen to the message from last week, Jesus and Politics, like the title alone should get you to listen, right? And Peter introduced us to this word last week when he's breaking this down, and it's a word that kind of gets under our skin a little bit because we are Americans who were born from a revolution. But it's the word submit or be subject to. Place yourself under someone else's authority. And what we learned is that when we realize we are a part of an eternal kingdom under the sovereign rule and control of Jesus, the King of Kings, that we recognize that all authority, all earthly authority is under His control. That God doesn't make mistakes. That whoever is in the White House is under God's control. That whoever's sitting on the throne in whatever part of the world that we want to point our finger, that all of that is under the sovereign control of the King of Kings. and that God is under control. And because of that, it impacts how we respond to the people who are in authority over us, even the evil ones we saw last week. And then we dove deeply into our supreme example in all of this at the end of chapter 2 last week. That Jesus is the ultimate example of the one who came and placed himself under the authority of the world in which he lived and suffered unjustly at the hands of those who eventually murdered him. And he put on display the attitude and the example that we are to follow as Jesus followers living in a strange world, headed to an eternal kingdom. And today, Peter takes it even more personal. Today, he takes it beyond the welcome mat into our front doors, and he knocks on our door and says, let's talk about what this looks like in your house. Let's talk about what this looks like. What does it mean to follow Jesus in the most intimate of relationships? How does this concept of living in submission under the authority of someone else, how does that work in the husband-wife dynamic? Now, this is not a subject that we can avoid because Scripture doesn't avoid it. And immediately when I read this text and that word, that scary word, submit, is there, it makes me like, can we skip over this and like go to the next text? But we preach the Bible here systematically at City Church, and that means we have to take the text as it comes, right? Because that's God speaking to us. And so we take the text, and like I tell you, week in and week out, we're going to go by this. And if I ever say anything that contradicts this, you go with this and not with me. Okay? But as your pastor and God's call on our heart and our church and our life, we preach the Bible here. And so we don't skip over tough texts like this. We understand them. We seek what is God saying to us. And what is important when we unpack this text is that the Scripture is crystal clear. And we have to understand what the Bible is saying and what the Bible is not saying. That's important, right? Because this type of issue can be abused. And so it's very important for us to say, what is the Bible saying about this husband-wife dynamic? And what is the Bible not saying in this idea? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, let me say this up front. The underlying principle of Scripture from Genesis forward is that God created men and women equal with different complementary roles in the marriage and in life. That God created men and women equal, yet with different roles, complementary roles, in marriage, in the church, in life in general. And I don't have to tell you that. Like, we know that men and women are different. Just from the video we played at the beginning, we understand that men and women are different. I saw a few pictures this week on the internet that reminds me of some of the differences in men and women. Here's one in my house. Evidently, my wife, who is significantly smaller than me, thinks that most of the bed is hers. Right? There's times that like I'll get up to do something, come back to the bed, and I'll just stop and look and be like, do you realize where you are in the bed? Like, you're expecting me to sleep in that? Like you realize I'm a grown man, right? Like, this is not 140 pounds we're dealing with here. Like, I need space to be able to sleep. Now, it wouldn't be so bad if my wife's body temperature wasn't naturally 25 degrees hotter all the time than mine. Like, I could fry an egg sometimes on her skin, I feel like, because her skin stays at that temperature. But this is common. Any other men have this issue in your house? Okay. We've got the biggest size bed we can get, so can't get any bigger. All right, here's another one that shows the differences. I like this one. This is the difference in how men and women buy shampoo. For women, see all those things: effectiveness, brand, smell. What does it do to my hair? Ingredients, color, design, popularity. How men choose shampoo. It says shampoo on the bottle. Right? Okay. Here's the difference in how men and women shop. Going to the Gap to buy a pair of pants. The blue line represents the man. He walks in the mall, walks to Gap, spends $33, takes him 6 minutes. That's how men shop. Female, on the other hand, 3 hours and 26 minutes later, and you can see her path through them all. Total cost for the jeans, $876. Any other men out there have a wife that when she gets home from shopping and you didn't go, suddenly you feel like you're a contestant on The Price is Right? Like all these bags, and they're pulling those bags out like, you're not going to believe what I spent on this blouse. I got this blouse for 40% off. I got these pair of pants for 20% off. I got this top for 17% off. I got this for buy two, get one free. Buy three, get a pair of shoes free. I feel like I'm on The Price is Right, like I'm being drilled. I got these 72 items, Devin, for $42.17, and it would have cost me $708 if I had paid full price. I don't care. Men and women are very different. Actually, I'm married to a person, believe it or not, that last slide doesn't apply to. Sometimes she likes to get in and out as quickly as I do. But we're in a tough text today. Men and women are different, and Peter breaks it down beyond the welcome mat for us. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read the whole text so we can get it out there, and then we're going to come back and we're going to walk through the text together, and Ashley's going to help us in this journey through the text. But let me read 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 first, and let's just get the text out there, and then we'll come back and walk through it. Likewise, and that's an important word to start with because it points us back to everything we've just talked about. How do we live under the authority of the government? How do we live under the authority of an unjust boss? How do we follow the example of Jesus? So he's pointing us back. Likewise, just like this is right in the whole chain of events of everything I've been talking about. Likewise, wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, the wearing of gold, or the putting on of clothes, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham. And I think it's fascinating that he uses the example of Sarah here, because Sarah was not like the meek, timid kind of female image that we think that he's painting here. She was kind of the opposite of that. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. I don't know about you men, but my wife's Lord sounds a lot like lard for some reason. We'll talk about what that verse means in just a moment. Calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. All right, kind of a tough text, right? We're going to walk through it together, and we're going to understand what Peter is saying and what he's not. Now, what I'm going to tell you right now is extremely important to understand the entire context of this passage. Let me give you a cultural breakdown of the role of women in ancient civilization. In ancient civilization, in the time that Peter was writing this epistle, women had no rights at all. Okay? This is very important. In Jewish culture, women were basically a thing. Just like men owned their horses and their sheep, they believed that they owned their women. And on no account could she leave him under Jewish law. On no account could she leave him. Although he could dismiss her at any moment for any reason. For a wife in Jewish culture to change her religion while her husband did not was unthinkable. That's Jewish culture. In Greek civilization, so during this time, there were three primary Jewish, Greek, and Roman cultures. Okay, so in Greek civilization, the duty of the woman was to, and I quote, remain indoor and be obedient to her husband. They had kind of this idea that she is to see little, hear little, and ask little, and just be in the home. No independent existence at all, no mind of her own. And again, a husband could divorce her almost at caprice, at whatever willful, fickle decision that he chose, as long as he returned her dowry. So if he gave her money back, the dowry which she invested into the marriage, he could basically divorce her for any reason. In Roman law, women had no rights at all. In Roman law, she basically remained forever in the role of almost a child. That under her father's power, he had the right of life and death over her if necessary, and she remained under her father's power until she married, and that power was then passed to her husband. And Roman history, if you read it, one, is extremely brutal. But if you read Roman history, it's filled with violence against women. Not only for things like infidelity, but drinking wine, appearing without a veil in public, speaking to another freed woman in public. And even in one instance in Roman history, we read of a woman being severely abused because she decided to go to the public Olympic-style games in that civilization. The culture of Peter's day and the culture of our day are worlds apart. They could hardly be more different as far as marriage and the place of a woman is concerned. So, for Peter to address women specifically and spend the majority of the verses talking about women is unheard of. And for them to embrace, to write to a group of ladies in this instance who were embracing a faith that was different than their husbands, was placing them at high risk. And they faced potential severe persecution, both at home and in their society. And yet Peter writes, and he supports and he encourages them. I know a lot of times in kind of our modern culture, we hear like the authors of the Bible had a very low view of women. If you understand the view of women in that ancient civilization, you really understand that Peter and Paul and Jesus had a very high view of women, an exalted view of women, particularly for their culture. And we'll see that in Peter's words here. So now that we've kind of set that up so that you understand what we're dealing with when we come to 1 Peter chapter 3 and how Jewish, Greek, and Roman culture all understood women in that modern time, now we can kind of sense the difficult dynamic that Peter's addressing in this text. And so now that we've kind of walked through that background, we're going to walk through this text together and deal with this tough but very biblical topic. And to help me do that, Ash is going to come to the stage. Would you help me welcome my beautiful wife and your director of ministry?
What up, Lord Devin?
Yeah. So let me say this first. Any of you that know our story know that we haven't always gotten any of this stuff we're going to talk about right. Okay? So those of you that may not know, and our story's out there enough that we're not ashamed of it in any way, it's a grace story. We both have had failed first marriages, largely our faults in those marriages, okay? So we come to any of this issue in a second marriage and from a very broken yet redeemed place in life, okay? So just know that coming in, that what we're talking about today is not things that Devin and Ashley have perfected. These are things that God is teaching us on our journey, that we are in this with you, right? We're all Jesus followers on this journey. So we're going to walk through the text together and seek to understand what God's teaching us through this text. And the first thing I want us to do is I want us to look at Peter's beautiful portrait in this text of womanhood. And then we'll kind of back into this idea of what submission is and what it's not. And then we'll talk about the man's role in all this as well. So let's back into it starting in chapter 3, and we'll go back to verse 5, and then we're going to make our way back toward verse 1. Because I think verse 5 is really the key to understanding this text. For this is how the holy women, and then here's the next phrase, and if you've been with us in 1 Peter, you'll recognize these words are common words in Peter's epistle. These are holy women, right, who hoped in God. Who hoped in God to adorn themselves by submitting to their husbands. So Peter kind of sets up this concept of holy women as women who are marked by, and there's the key word to not just this text but the whole book, marked by hope. And we've talked about how hope is really a confidence. It's not just wishful thinking. It is a confidence in who God is. The theme of the book of 1 Peter is suffering. The Christian response to suffering in this book is that we live with hope. Confidence in who God is. And so what Peter describes as holy women, and we've said that holiness is not a list of to-dos and don'ts, is it? That holiness is being conformed to who Jesus is. being like Jesus, that we've kind of missed what holiness is a lot of times in the modern church. The holiness is really about God transforming us into the image of Jesus. And so when Peter defines holy women, he begins with this concept of having hope in God. So Ashley, tell us, what does that look like?
Well, I think it's pretty interesting from a female perspective. And when Devin and I were discussing this week, it is true that men and women think differently. And so when I initially kind of started thinking, what is it about putting my hope in something other than my marriage, my security, the things that are tangible on earth, what is it that's so important about that? And it really is huge for me. It's very personal for me because it's been a lot of my journey is learning that my hope ultimately needs to be in the Lord. And so even when we get into discussion today, like something about submission, we can use the word submission, and it's like makes every woman's hairs raise on their arm. And, you think like, oh, this is some huge subject that we don't want to talk about. But when it comes to something like this, it's about such a bigger picture than the word submission. And so hope and learning to put my hope in God helps to take the pressure off of me putting my hope in Devin, me putting my hope in the security of our jobs, me putting my hope in my family or the approval of people around me, because that's like a huge one for women. I know that the easiest thing for me is to put my hope in my marriage because it is an intimate relationship. And so a lot of times I can replace that with God. When we go through things, we have troubles or there's different obstacles in our lives, things that we're going through. It's easy for me to want to cling on to Devin because he's physical there for me. But throughout this whole book and throughout the whole Bible, in these chapters, Peter is pushing us to think outside of that. We've been talking about that living hope, having an eternal perspective. But even within our marriages and as a woman, having a perspective that's beyond my marriage is where you have to start with that subject.
Okay, so really Ash's ultimate hope is not in me. It doesn't mean she doesn't have confidence in me or who God's gifted me to be. Or if you're a single woman, the hope of getting a husband. Like a lot of times that'll be what drives a lady or finding the right guy. When we moved back to the South, and Ash was working in an insurance office and was interacting with a lot of people. We used to talk about kind of an unhealthy obsession among a lot of people that were single, that were desperately looking for a man all the time. What does that look like? Is this the right one, not one? And so what Peter's telling us is the holiness of a woman is grounded in this woman whose hope is not in just a husband or getting a husband or her looks, he'll talk about, but it's that bigger hope of resting in who God is and who she is in Jesus. Now, here's what that means for me with Ash. What that means for me is when her confidence is in who God created her to be and who she is in Jesus, that I'm not threatened by that. That, as a matter of fact, that's attractive to me. That the depth of her beauty is in her hope in Jesus. That when I see her living out a confidence in who God is and who God created her to be, that's beautiful to me. That I'm drawn to that in her because she's finding her hope ultimately in someone that can't let her down and won't let her down.
I think that like when we talk about that, my heart in this is in our discussion today for you guys to understand that this is not like a one and done thing. Like we're on a journey. And I always get a little bit timid when we kind of have discussions like this because it's easy as a Christian to just want to like put a stamp on something and be like, problem solved, moved on to the next thing. But this is not something that just happens in your life. It is a work of God on the journey. And so I look back even at my first marriage and the things that I went through and the things that I did so wrong. And God's worked in me to help me to understand that this is a daily choice. And we as women need to work to put our roots down in the Lord and find our hope in Him, so that in those moments where we are kind of finding our identity in things outside God, we can identify it. And so that's what part the journey is saying it's not fixed. We're human. We're always going to deal with it. But choosing to say, I'm recognizing in this moment, and what I'm not doing is putting my hope in God first. And so that's what that looks like.
Yeah, it's not a wife saying, well, I don't care if you let me down or not. Ultimately, my hope's in God. Her confidence is still in me, seeking Jesus, right? Until her ultimate confidence comes in Christ. So that if something in life happens, even if I was taken from her or whatever, that ultimately she finds her hope and confidence in the one who can't disappoint her and who is eternal. And as Ash said, it's a step on the journey constantly. It's not, all right, I've reached that mark, let me move on to the next one. It's a constant, as it is for each of us, resting in who Jesus is. All right, let's go to verse 6. And this is one of the controversial verses in this passage. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. So, one, just this phrase, calling him Lord, that was nothing but a title of respect. Didn't have anything to do with like Jesus as the Lord of Lords. It wasn't like he was her master in any way. It was just a title of respect in ancient civilizations. So don't get too freaked out about that. What it's saying is that Sarah lived in this relationship of respect with Abraham, her husband. And you can go back and read the story of Sarah and Abraham and realize that she wasn't a meek, timid, childlike figure in Abraham's life in any way. The key to this verse, though, is not as much that as from this idea of secure hope in Jesus, we also see kind of this second characteristic of what Peter defines as holy women, is those who do not fear anything that is frightening. And so what flows from this hope is an attitude of fearlessness, an attitude of living without fear. A confidence in who God is drives out fear of my past, of my present, of my future. When I live with my identity in Jesus, in who God is, it carves away the fear and insecurity in my heart, and it fights that anxiety that tends to rise when bad things happen in life. So, babe, talk about that a little bit. What does that look like? A hope in God that results in kind of this attitude of fearlessness.
Well, if you think about the idea of fearlessness, and like if you put yourself in, as best you can, the position of what these women felt like back in the, when Peter's writing this, these women are in a situation where they have no freedom. They have no say. They don't sit down and have conversations with their husband. Their husband's like, hey, babe, tell me how you're feeling. Like in your dreams. That never happened. So even when you think about how they had to handle things, I would imagine that they lived with a lot of fear. And I think, and this is more my opinion, but I think that women in general tend to live by fear a little bit more easily than men do. And I think that's true for me. I can be driven by fear, the choices I make, how I handle things, how I interact with my husband. I can be driven by fear of something I can't control. And a lot of that within a marriage relationship is fear of something happening that you can't fix. And I'm marked by that in my life because I have lived that way, and I still struggle with it, and I have to identify those moments where I'm fearful of things from my past affecting my future, or I'm fearful of Devin letting me down because I've been let down before. Maybe I'm fearful that I'll let him down because I've let people down before. And so a lot of the attitude of fearlessness goes back to placing your hope in something that won't ever fail you. And so as a woman, it takes circumstances out of it. If I have an attitude that I know that I can trust my God, whether I can trust him or not, it'd be nice if I could feel that way, but that is not something that controls my understanding and my confidence in who Jesus is. And so as a woman, when it comes to submission and the idea that God has placed me in a relationship with my husband that ideally I want to be able to trust him, there's times where he's going to let me down. And so my fear of that can't control me, because ultimately what I'm resting in is God, and that he's faithful, that he's the one that takes care of me, and that he's sovereign over my marriage and over every other situation that I have. So when our hope is in the Lord, our actions shout the gospel, right? And that bleeds out into our marriage.
Okay. So it's I would say that Ashley and I are learning that ultimately when her trust is in Jesus, the one who will never leave her or forsake her, that ultimately gives her confidence with me as well, that she lives with a confidence that because she trusts Jesus, she trusts that Jesus will enable me to be able to be the type of husband that I need to be for her.
Or
She's
I'm
able to
less
trust.
stressed about you screwing it up.
Right. Maybe shouldn't be. But she trusts Jesus with me. Does that make sense? Ultimately, she trusts Jesus, so part of that is I have to trust Jesus with my husband as well. Right? So I know as women, even more than men at times, it's kind of a difficult balance between those two worlds. All right, let's move to 3 and 4 as we kind of, again, back into this idea of submission. So she is, again, marked by this hope and this fearlessness. And then 3, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of your hair, the wearing of gold, or the putting on of clothing. And let me just get this out of the way. Peter's not saying you should not do those things, or if there is some groups that will try to argue you shouldn't wear jewelry or whatever. If he was saying that, then we have to take the logical conclusion that he's also saying don't wear clothes, right? Based on what he says here, and we are not confident that's what Peter's saying. So he's not talking about don't wear these things, but 4 is the key. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart. And I love this next phrase, with the imperishable beauty. Imperishable, can't be taken away. The imperishable, it doesn't die. The imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. So again, he's not saying that all women should just be gentle and quiet, because that's not some of your personalities. It's not Ash's personality, is to be quiet. The two of us, she's more likely to carry on a conversation with you than me, right? And so, again, he's not saying you should have a personality that's simply quiet and meek. What he's saying is that when a hope-filled, fearless woman puts her confidence in God and not in her husband and not in just her looks, it impacts her heart. That there's an inner tranquility, an inner peace about her that can't be taken. It's imperishable. An inner beauty about her that is not defined by the external, but the internal, the gentleness and a quiet spirit before God. I love that. A tranquil, quiet, humble spirit before God. And did you notice what he said there? That is precious in God's sight. So this woman with confidence and hope in who God is, that lives trusting in Jesus, which drives out fears of the temporary, is defined by this inner tranquility because of who she trusts in. And that's precious in God's sight. So, babe, what is the balance between the external and the internal? Because that's a tough one.
So, first of all, I put on all my gold jewelry and my heels for this question because there is a balance. So, Peter is not saying, don't care about yourself on the outside because the inside is the only thing that matters. It's important for us to be ourselves, be who you are. And I think even when you talk about submission, like one of the things I used to always think about submission is that kind of made every woman have to be alike. Like we're all supposed to have the same type of relationships with our husband, kind of June Cleaver, like, babe, are you hungry for a sandwich? Can I get you anything?
Oh, yes, I am.
And if anyone knows Devin and I's relationship, it's not like that. I'm kind of feisty and I'm opinionated, and he makes me sandwiches. But the reality of it is that Peter isn't laying this out to make all women feel like they have to be the same, and that our marriage relationships don't look the same. We all have different strengths and different weaknesses. We are going to function differently, And so the issue of submission is not, this is exactly how you're supposed to function. It's an attitude, and it's about your heart. And we can't miss that. We can't miss that this is a heart issue. It's not, let's make our list of do this, don't do this, and if you aren't this way, you're not the cutesy Christian couple. Like, I hate that thought. So what my emphasis just from a female perspective is I have had to be challenged to put more time and energy on growing my heart towards Jesus than I do coloring my hair, making sure I don't have wrinkles, buying clothes, whatever. I need to put more emphasis on who I am from a heart perspective than I do from an outward perspective. Does that make sense? So it's not Peter saying, all women be homely. It doesn't even matter. Don't shower. No big deal. It's just saying, please emphasize and care more about your heart. So here's the deal. At the end of the day, my heart is really what matters. It's about me and God. And Devin and I's relationship is second to that. And so if I focus on that more, then the natural overflow to that is he's going to observe that I'm not trusting in him. And even if you aren't married to someone who understands or has a relationship with Jesus, it changes the way that they start to view you. Like, they know that you're not hanging on to every single thing like it's the end of the world if they do something right or wrong. Because at the end of the day, you're over here focusing on, here's what God's called me to do, and then that bleeds into your marriage really naturally.
Yeah, I think it goes back to a word we've been talking about the whole time, identity, right? Is your identity primarily in everything external, or is it in Jesus? And that's a tough thing in our culture of Instagram and pornography and all these kind of false images that we've put up of what beauty looks like, right? And so, like, as a man, I can't connect to that as well because I'm not threatened by the dude that's on TV with a six-pack of abs. Like, as a man, like, that doesn't threaten men the way that Ash's personality is wired to think, do I measure up to whatever images culture has created? And what Peter is saying is true beauty is not about what you see on Instagram. That true beauty is a heart issue. And that makes her even more attractive to me. Now, because she has a heart for Jesus, it gives her a heart for me. She wants to be beautiful to me. She knows the things I'm attracted to and all that. So it drives her in our relationship in both directions to ultimately know her identity is found in Jesus, but in the confidence of our relationship as well. And so I like how Peter kind of puts these worlds together and talks about the imperishable beauty. Because we all know bodies change, right? Our bodies change, but inward beauty only grows deeper, no matter what happens externally. And so cultivate the internal. And then let's get to the kind of sticky verses. 1 and 2, likewise, wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, and they see your respectful and pure conduct. So, again, let's back into this. This woman who's been marked by hope, her confidence in Jesus, fearlessness, that confidence in Jesus drives out external fears, inner beauty, she lives it out. This confidence, fearlessness, inner beauty, she lives it out in the most intimate of relationships, which is the relationship with her husband. In a way, don't miss this, she lives it out in a way that Peter says wins his heart. It wins his heart. She lives out this hope, confidence, fearlessness, inner beauty in a way that captures the heart of her husband, in a way that wins his heart. And Peter describes this life pattern that I've just laid out for you as willful submission. That's the label he puts on it, willful submission. And here's where it gets sticky, because of the concept that submission has taken on in our culture, this false portrayal of what submission is. So let's talk about what submission is and what submission is not. So let's talk about first what submission does not mean. And we'll just kind of go back and forth. The first thing that I would say submission does not mean. It does not mean that you agree with everything your husband says or does. And if you lived in my house very long, you'd know that's the case. It does not mean that you agree with everything that your husband says or does. That it does not mean that you can't have an opinion. That is not submission. Okay? What else does it not mean?
It does not mean that you leave your brain or your will behind. Lord knows that's true, because it's important in a marriage for two people to feel like their opinions and their thoughts and the things that they believe are valued. So it's not leaving that and just walking away from who you are. You are an independent thinker. You are an individual. That is no different. And both people have that to bring to the marriage.
Right. It doesn't mean she just surrenders her will and thinking to me. She's an independent thinker that God's created her with her own brain, her own thoughts, her own will, her own desires. And submission is not her relinquishing that in any way. She's created as Ashley. And she finds her ultimate fulfillment by thinking and doing the things that God's created her to be and do. Submission also, thirdly, does not mean that a wife always does what her husband demands. Okay? And if a husband's demanding, he's missed the whole idea of what he's supposed to be in Jesus. And so it does not mean, and I'll say this because this is extremely important, it does not mean that a woman lives in any type of abuse situation at any level. You hear me clearly? It does not give any grounds for abuse at any level, that a woman is not under any obligation to subject herself to abuse at any level. So that's not what submission is. What else, babe?
It also means that you do not put your husband before Jesus.
That's a good one.
And that's a huge one. That's probably the most difficult one. I think that we idolize marriage. We idolize marriage more than probably anything else. We as women want to feel that relationship, and we obsess about it too much. So it's easy for us to put our husband before Jesus, but we have got to get to a place in our lives where Jesus is always number one and your husband is always number two. And those two things out of order, it'll jack up your life.
Right. Okay. And then the next one I would mention, submission does not mean that a woman is inferior in any way. There's no superiority here. That she's not inferior in any way. It's simply a difference in roles and what God has created us to be. It's a difference in roles. Do not think for a second that that husband-wife relationship is anything similar to a parent-child relationship. It's not. It's not the man's responsibility or the woman's responsibility to give orders to the other person to simply obey like a parent obeys a child or a soldier obeys a general. It's not that's not the dynamic of the husband and wife in Scripture. And so it's not an inferiority in any way. It's simply a difference in roles, how God created us to be. Then mention one more.
I got to find out. I'm not the preacher here, so I don't really know. Oh, you enable your husband's sin or your responsibility. I think one of the misconceptions is that you think if I'm being submissive, I just let whatever fly. That I don't have any position to call out sin, and that in turn I have to enable that. And that is not biblical submission. And so we live in a sinful world, and we're both sinful people. And so you have moments in your life where you don't excuse sin from happening in your relationship.
Okay, so that's an idea of what it's not. Let's talk briefly about what willful submission, biblical submission is. And I think in this text and throughout other texts in the Bible that we see two primary God-prescribed matters when it comes to submission. We'll just break it down. We can use a lot of words here, but we'll break it down to these two words. It's the concept of respect, and I mean that in a way like value and honor, respect and affirmation. That God has placed men in a position of leadership within the home. That's a God call that I believe the Bible teaches, and that the primary role of a wife in that relationship is to respect and affirm him as that leader. And let's jump back to the text that Peter says, wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see a respectful and pure conduct. So Peter speaks of winning a husband without a word, strictly based on their conduct. Now, think about our context here. Peter is addressing primarily women who are living in relationships with unbelieving husbands in a culture that says you can't do that. And Peter says if you want to win the hearts of those who are outside of the Christian faith, so obviously this applies to us as believers as well, if you want to win their hearts, you do so by honoring and affirming them. These women are exiles in their own marriage. And some of you identify with that. You have a husband who's not a believer or is not following Jesus closely, and so you kind of identify with what Peter's talking about here. And so Peter gives some very strong words of respect and affirmation. So babe, what does that mean? Respect, affirmation, what is that not? What is it?
Yeah, I think it's really important when it comes to respect, that in a marriage, we need to have a mutual respect for each other. It's a mutual honoring and a mutual value. So what that means, though, is that I place a high priority to make sure that Devin knows that in spite of him, God's called me to put value on who he is as my husband. That's something that no other man deserves from me. That's reserved for your husband, and that is a call. And then from that it's my job to consistently affirm that in him. And I think that y'all probably understand in that day-to-day marriage relationship, there's a lot of ways that we know we can either do really good at that or we can jack it up. And things like nagging, and I know sometimes like when I get ticked, I get kind of loud and I'm just like wanting to call it out. And a lot of times in this passage, I've felt God kind of tugging at my heart to say, sometimes just being quiet is what I want you to do. Like, let me do the work and let your actions show that you trust God more than anything else. Things like putting guilt trip, constantly being on him. One thing I think that we need to think about is, are we being more intentional to affirm and edify our husbands? Even if his list of things is forever long and he is driving me nuts and I disagree with everything that he's saying, am I finding ways to intentionally affirm and edify who he is, the things about him that are good? Like, where am I placing that focus? We have a lot of power with our words, with our actions, and also with our physical responsibility to our husbands. That awesome relationship we get to experience, we can use those things for negative. And so it kind of is a little bit of a power feeling. Like, if you're ticked at your husband because of X, Y, and Z, or you don't agree with the decision he's making, there's a lot of ways we can let him know that, right? And so as women, part of us learning to put our hope and be fearless in the midst of that is that silent consistency of choosing in that moment to not do something for the sake that maybe Devin would non-verbally understand that my actions and my heart are placing value and affirmation on who he is as my husband.
All right. So, men, all studies inside, outside of Christian circles show that men need affirmation. And Ashley can use that to her advantage or disadvantage. And so, again, the key is, does my silent consistency affirm who my husband is? Now, we're going to have to get through some of this more quickly. So let me just say this. Submission is more about disposition and inclination. Do I respect and affirm my husband? Again, she doesn't have that obligation to anyone else, any other man. Do I respect and affirm my husband? And because men need affirmation, I want to find that ultimately in my wife and not some other person at the office or whatever that's going to seek to affirm me. And so that's part of Peter's call here. So let's say this. Husbands are fallible. Husbands make huge mistakes. And wives who are seeking Jesus will be in tune to those moments and able to express their hesitancy in a way that honors and affirms the husband, but enables the husband to make a clearer decision for the good of the family. Like, if I'm going to make a decision that she disagrees with because I know she has a heart for Jesus, right? Her hesitancy when we have that conversation enables me to take a step back and say, maybe I need to rethink this, or let's have a clearer decision. So here's what I would say to men. Part of leading a family is leading them spiritually. And if we are praying together and seeking Jesus together, then major decisions in our lives bring unity, not division. It brings us closer to Jesus. Okay, so let's transition really quickly to husbands. Not because there's not a lot to say to husbands, because our time is ticking. 7, likewise husbands. So again, under that same umbrella, same genre, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So Peter's primary instruction for husbands is about honoring our wives. So Peter says, live in an understanding way. And you say, Devin, if that means I have to understand my wife, I'm out, right? That's not what he's saying. Like, you have to understand women. What he's saying is, I'm conscious of her, I'm attentive of her needs, I'm aware of her, I'm sensitive toward her, I get to know her, I'm a student of my wife. That's how I value and honor her. That I am her, as Edward McCain or whatever his name is says in the song, I'm the biggest fan of her life. That's so cheesy.
So cheesy.
That I'm a student of Ashley. I'm conscious of her, attentive to her in every way, and value and honor her. Do you want to add quick additional thoughts to that?
Yeah, I think that that men and women both need to be attentive to the love language of their spouse. And that this is a way that we can get through to our husbands, and it's also a way for husbands to be really in tune with how to best love their spouse. So if y'all don't know about the 5 love languages, go look that up. I know that my love language is quality time. So Devin knows that. If he wants to get with me, he's not going to bring home 25 gifts. He's going to sit down and spend some time with me. So when you have a marital relationship, it's important to invest time into understanding what gets through to each other. The last thing I would say is it is important for a husband to, part of the submission conversation is, as a woman, we want to feel like our husbands actually care about what we think. They value who we are. They feel like we contribute and we're smart and intelligent and we can hold our own, right? And so Devin can do things to communicate that to me that helps me to honor him even more. So as a husband, you can enable your wife to love you better in focusing on the so specific ways that you can place a value on who she is as a woman, not even just your wife.
Yeah, one of the ways that I know hurts Ashley, one thing that I know hurts Ashley is if she feels like I do not value her opinion on something. So I have to be conscious to make sure she understands I do value and honor what she brings to the table and to the conversation, which affirms her inner beauty in those moments. So let me just allude to Peter's reference here of showing honor to the weaker vessel. Again, don't look at that as a negative thing. There's a lot of different opinions on what that means. I actually think it means he's talking about just naturally that women are physically weaker than men. Okay? It's just natural the way God has created us, not weak in who you are or can't stand on your own 2 feet, nothing like that. I think it's a physical weakness that naturally leaves a woman in a place of vulnerability. And again, there's plenty of studies out there that show that part of the instinct of women is that they want to be protected. And so as part of me honoring and valuing her, it's giving her a sense of security in our marriage, in our home, that I'm going to take care, that I'm going to protect her and take care of her. Here's what it boils down to for me: that Ashley is my highest human priority. My highest human priority. Over every other relationship, outside of my relationship with Jesus, that she is my highest human priority. And that gives her a confidence and a security in our relationship. And that's part of honoring and valuing her. So the phrase I use for that is attentive leadership. That God has called me to lead our home, but to do so with an attentive ear. That if she is my highest human priority and those kids are my second highest human priority, then they're going to dictate a lot of the way I lead the home, because I value them and honor her as my highest human priority and them as my second highest human priority. That changes everything about the way I lead the home. So loving Jesus and valuing the people in my home as my highest human priorities changes everything about the way I live out my call as a God man, as a godly man. So, if you're a husband and wife, you share the most intimate matters in life. Sexual, emotional, financial, spiritual, physical, all those things are about intimacy. And intimacy requires work and devotion. And God calls on men, listen to me closely, God calls on men to step up and lead our families in these areas. What's the example Jesus used? Men are to love as Jesus loved the church. Pretty high standard right there. Sacrificial love as Jesus loved the church. That's how Jesus defines the relationship of a man to his wife and to his family. As Jesus loved the church. That's a pretty high mark. And so in these verses, in that verse 7, Peter gives those two reminders. You're both recipients of grace, right? So display grace. There's no superiority here. We're both resting in grace. We're both sinners who need grace. And then he even says there's spiritual effects for failing to honor our wives. He says your prayers can be hindered. Your spiritual walk can be hindered if you're not honoring your wife and valuing her as she deserves. So men have a high calling to step up and lead as God has intended them to lead. And so men, I challenge you to rise up and step up to the occasion. God forbid that you can conquer the world in Call of Duty, but can't lead your family. Right? Step up. That's the real war of life, right? It's not what we see on a screen that we are operating with our thumbs. The real war in life is, are we leading our families as they deserve to be led? And am I honoring and valuing the people that God has placed in my life? So I'm going to wrap it up. You got any other additional thought?
I think the only other thing that Devin and I really wanted to express to you guys is we're all in really different places. And I know that there's people in here that are struggling in their marriage, that are not married any longer, that want to be married. But I also know that there's people in here that one of you puts your hope in Jesus and the other doesn't. And so Devin and I really want to communicate with you that this is difficult and we know it. And that for those of you that are in a marriage where it might just be you and your spouse doesn't get the whole Jesus thing, we have compassion for you. We want what is best for your heart. And God promises us that if we focus on our hearts, that He can change the rest, and He can. And so we want you to have hope in that. I think that our hesitancy is we don't want to just talk about like some cutesy marriage concept, like, oh, go home and, treat each other well. And that lasts like an hour and then you're failing at it again. This is practical, putting our hope in God, becoming women and men that are fearless, that our roots are grounded in Him, so that our marriage circumstances are not dictated by anything but our hope in God. And so that, I think we just really want to make sure you guys know this is a journey. We're on it. We don't have it together, and everyone's in a different place, and that's okay. And we're there to meet with you on that.
Okay, so let me just bring it full circle to the gospel. God has specific roles for husbands and wives. And as we submit to God and live out grace-filled lives, grace is a way of life, as we live out grace-filled lives, marriage is a wonderful gift and a wonderful blessing. Jesus came to reestablish biblical manhood and womanhood. Sin perverts God's intentions. Sin destroys God's intentions. And when that happens in the marriage relationship, when sin perverts things, husbands become either domineering, right? Or they become passive. And wives either become manipulative or they become doormats. Both extremes, and both are equally wrong. Both are equally wrong. Paul says that we are living in a world that is groaning for the gospel, that is groaning for God to bring redemption. And part of that groaning is that our tendency either is to be completely passive as men, to be completely passive, or to try to be domineering over the person that we're supposed to value and honor the most. And the natural groaning effects of a woman is to either become a doormat and get trampled on, or to try to manipulate their husband in some way. And so when Jesus came, what he does is he demonstrates what marriage should look like in his relationship with the church that the Bible calls his bride. You can go read about all this in Ephesians 5. And it points us to the gospel, that the gospel points us to what marriage should be. That husbands are not to be lethargic, but they're to be active. So active, Jesus says, that we would lay down our lives for our wife, just as Jesus did for his church. That's active in the relationship. And we lead by loving and serving our wives in a way that strengthens and encourages her inner beauty and values her. The wife submits to the husband as the church submits to Jesus, not in a manipulative way or in a doormat way, in a way that displays the gospel before other people. And when the home is in disorder, it mars the gospel and what the gospel is supposed to be. It draws people away from God. It hinders the spiritual walk of our children. We all know problems do not disappear when you become a Jesus follower, do they? They don't disappear in the home. They don't disappear in our lives. They don't disappear at work. Problems don't go away. Our marriages are not perfect. Our marriages are grace-filled. That we're both sinners. We constantly joke to each other about that. You're a sinner, I forgive you. We're a sinner, we'll learn better. But there's a truth to that we are sinners living grace-filled lives. So let's take it back to Adam and Eve, and then we're done. When Eve sinned in the garden, Adam was supposed to be like Jesus. Adam was supposed to die in her place. That's the role of the man. When Eve sinned, Adam should have died in her place. But he didn't. He failed. And he sinned. Here's the gospel. But where the first Adam failed, the second Adam, the New Testament says, Jesus Christ, succeeded. Where the first Adam failed and sinned, the second Adam succeeded. And he displays what it means to love his bride and to purify her through the Word of God. Jesus came to fix and restore broken people and broken marriages. And that's the beauty of the gospel. That Jesus came to fix, heal, and restore broken people, and in return, broken marriages. There's a phrase that when Ash and I were on our own journey and trying to figure out what does it look like to be married on a foundation that is sinful and wrong and everything about our story. We heard a guy speak that used a phrase that we've adopted for 5 years now that we cling to. And the phrase is second marriage grace. That statistics all say that our marriage should fail. Like, you get that, right? Like, not only do first marriages have kind of a, almost 50-50 death rate now, but second marriages fail over 75% of the time. And so every statistic says that our marriage should fail. Second marriage grace says to us that grace defies statistics, right? And so we cling to second marriage grace. We cling to the gospel because it's only in the gospel that we find healing and redemption and hope for not just our hearts individually, but for our lives as a couple. And that's what we want for you guys. Some of you guys are in first marriages, second marriages, third marriages, not yet married. We're all at different places in life. But what we want for you are grace-filled lives that impact your life individually and your life as a couple, living as Jesus intends and as Jesus displayed, laying down his life on a cross for you and I. Everybody good? All right. let's bow our heads for prayer, and we'll let you guys out of here.